never thought the quiet hours at a dying man's bedside would change the course of my life. To me, he wasn't the billionaire, though the world knew him as one of the most powerful financiers in the country. To me, he was simply Mr. Alcott, a man with a sharp wit that illness had softened, whose nights were haunted by memories he rarely spoke of. I was his nurse. I knew his blood pressure better than I knew his fortune, his medication routine better than his business empire, and in those final weeks, I became a witness to something few get to see: how even the richest souls are stripped bare when time grows short. Sometimes, he would reach for my hand and whisper, "I had a niece once, little Elizabeth. Lost her in the storms of our family wars." His eyes would glaze over then, as though searching in the dark for something he could never retrieve. So when he passed, and the will was read, I wasn't surprised to hear that his estate, every sprawling mansion, every staggering account, was to go to his lost niece, Elizabeth. My chest tightened, not because I had expected anything, but because I thought of all the nights I'd seen him smile faintly at my name tag, almost tenderly, whenever he read it, Elizabeth. Still, I gathered my things quietly, preparing to slip out of the lawyer's office. My role complete. This was family business after all. That's when the lawyer paused. He adjusted his glasses, eyes narrowing slightly as he looked directly at me. "Miss," he said carefully, "what is your full legal name?" The room fell silent. My voice trembled as I replied, "Elizabeth. Elizabeth Ann Carter." He exhaled, as though a puzzle had clicked into place. "Then it seems," he said, turning the pages deliberately, "that Mr. Alcott has already found his lost niece." I froze. My knees buckled under the weight of disbelief. Me, the girl who had grown up in foster care, who had stitched her life together with night shifts and quiet resilience. How could I be the one he meant? And then it hit me. All those nights he'd asked me to tell him about my childhood. All the times his gaze softened when I mentioned the name of a mother I barely remembered. He had known. He had been waiting for me to know too. The inheritance was never really about the billions. It was about a legacy of love, about recognizing that even the ones who feel forgotten might carry the very blood, the very story, of those who thought they'd lost them. That day, I didn't just inherit wealth. I inherited proof that we are never as invisible as we think. I never thought the quiet hours at a dying man's bedside would change the course of my life. To me, he wasn't the billionaire, though the world knew him as one of the most powerful financiers in the country. To me, he was simply Mr. Alcott, a man with a sharp wit that illness had softened, whose nights were haunted by memories he rarely spoke of. I was his nurse. I knew his blood pressure better than I knew his fortune, his medication routine better than his business empire, and in those final weeks, I became a witness to something few get to see: how even the richest souls are stripped bare when time grows short. He had a way of talking in fragments, like a man whose life had been too vast to be spoken of fully. Sometimes, in the half-light of his bedroom, when machines hummed low, he would reach for my hand and whisper, "I had a niece once, little Elizabeth. Lost her in the storms of our family wars." His eyes would glaze over then, as though searching in the dark for something he could never retrieve. I thought of that often. A niece named Elizabeth. A ghost of his past. Perhaps that was why he sometimes looked at me strangely. When I adjusted his pillows, or wrote notes in his chart, I dismissed it as coincidence. Elizabeth was not an uncommon name. When he passed, the house felt too large for the silence that followed. The staff walked softly, as though footsteps might disturb the air he had once filled with his presence. I packed away the charts, the medications, the tiny rituals of care, and reminded myself that my work with him was finished. But grief lingers, even when duty ends. The will reading came quickly. I attended only because the lawyer had asked me to sign some medical documents confirming the timeline of his last hours. I sat in the back of the wood-paneled office, listening. As his family, faces I had rarely seen, shifted uneasily in their chairs. They expected fortunes, recognition, the heavy crown of inheritance. The lawyer's voice carried in a steady monotone, reading clauses and conditions, until he reached the heart of it. Everything, every estate, every staggering account, every legacy, was to go to his lost niece, Elizabeth. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Gasps, whispers, the shuffle of expensive shoes. I felt an odd tightening in my chest, not because I had expected anything, but because the name stirred something in me. Elizabeth. He had said it so many times, and every time his eyes had softened, as if recalling something tender and broken all at once. I lowered my head, preparing to leave. This was family business, not mine. I was only the nurse who had kept him comfortable, who had borne witness to his final days. That's when the lawyer paused. He adjusted his glasses, eyes narrowing slightly as he looked directly at me. "Miss," he said carefully, "what is your full legal name?" The question hung in the air, almost absurd in its simplicity. Every gaze in the room turned toward me. I felt my face flush, my hands tremble. My voice came out small, but steady. "Elizabeth. Elizabeth Ann Carter." A slow exhale escaped his lips, like the sound of a puzzle clicking into place. He flipped back through the pages with deliberate care. "Then it seems," he said, with the gravity of someone speaking a verdict, "that Mr. Alcott has already found his lost niece." The world tilted. My knees buckled under the weight of disbelief. Me, the girl who had grown up in foster care, who had stitched her life together with night shifts and second-hand textbooks, who had known loneliness more intimately than security. How could I be the one he meant? But memory rushed back in waves. The quiet nights when he asked me to tell him about my childhood. How he had listened, really listened, when I described my mother, whose face I could barely remember, but whose name lingered faintly in my mind. How his expression softened, almost broke, when I mentioned that name. He had known. Long before the papers, long before the reading, he had known. He hadn't said it outright because perhaps he wanted me to discover it in my own time. Or maybe he thought I would never know, and so he left it there, waiting in, ink and signature, for me to finally see myself as he had seen me. I felt tears burn hot behind my eyes. Not because of the fortune, it was so vast I couldn't even comprehend it, but because of what it meant. I was not invisible. I was not a girl who had been cast aside by everyone. Somewhere in the broken lines of family and loss, I belonged. That day, I didn't just inherit wealth. I inherited proof that I had been seen all along. Proof that the love I had given without agenda, the late nights, the patient care, the quiet listening, was not only returned, but remembered. And for the first time in my life, I felt what it meant to be chosen, not for what I could give, not for the duty I carried, but for who I was all along. The lawyer's voice carried in a steady monotone, reading clauses and conditions, until he reached the heart of it. Everything, every estate, every staggering account, every legacy, was to go to his lost niece Elizabeth. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Gasps rose from throats that had been holding breath. Whispers darted like startled birds between relatives who had gathered with stiff anticipation. The shuffle of expensive shoes and silk. Skirts stirred the polished floor, but no one dared speak loudly. Some shifted forward, eager to catch any further clarification. Others stiffened, as if their dignity could not bend toward disbelief. I felt an odd tightening in my chest, not because I had expected anything, but because the name stirred something in me. Elizabeth. My own name, spoken by him so many times, always with that curious softness. I remembered the way his gaze lingered on my name tag, his lips shaping the word with something closer to reverence than routine. I remembered the nights when he told me of his niece, his voice fragile as tissue, almost like he was speaking into the void in hope it would answer back. The room brimmed with confusion, but my body reacted differently. I lowered my head, fingers gripping the strap of my worn leather bag, preparing to slip away. This was family business, I told myself, not mine. I was the nurse, the shadow at the edge of his final days, the one who had kept his body comfortable, while his mind roamed the ruins of memory. I did not belong in this chamber of heirs and legacies. I stood, quiet, trying to make myself invisible, in the swell of outrage and disbelief around me. My chair scraped faintly against the wood, but before I could take a step, the lawyer's voice cut through the noise. "Miss," he said carefully, each syllable deliberate. "What is your full legal name?" For a moment, I thought I had misheard. The question felt absurd in its simplicity, and yet the weight of every eye turning toward me made my pulse stumble. The chatter hushed. The silence pressed in again, denser now, curious and hostile at once. I swallowed, my throat dry. My voice, when it came, was smaller than I intended, but it carried. "Elizabeth? Elizabeth Ann Carter." The lawyer's face shifted. He exhaled slowly, like a man who had been holding a secret longer than was comfortable. His fingers moved back through the papers, stopping at a line, tracing it with authority. "Then it seems," he said, his tone flattening into solemn confirmation, "that Mr. Alcott has already found his lost niece." The room erupted. Chairs scraped. Voices rose. A chorus of disbelief. Someone muttered sharply, "Impossible." Another hissed, "She's no relative." I felt the heat of their stares sear through me, as if my skin itself was being questioned, as though my very name had no right to exist in the same air as theirs. But inside me, everything slowed. The words echoed in a hollow I hadn't realized was still open. Lost niece. Me. I stood frozen. Every fragment of my life, every foster home, every night shift, every forgotten birthday, suddenly colliding with the possibility that I wasn't as rootless as I'd believed. My knees trembled. My hand tightened around the strap of my bag, knuckles white. The room blurred at the edges, yet his voice from the past cut through, clear as the oxygen hiss I used to monitor by his bed. "I had a niece once, little Elizabeth. It was me. He had been speaking of me all along, and he had left his fortune, not to a stranger, but to the girl who had been sitting by his side, unaware she was not just nurse, but kin. Would you like me to continue expanding into the aftermath? Scene in the lawyer's office, with more dialogue from the angry relatives and Elizabeth's stunned reaction, or move into Elizabeth's memories with Mr. Alcott that now take on new meaning. The world tilted under me. My knees buckled with a weight I could hardly comprehend. Me, the girl who had learned to live on scraps of kindness, who had grown up in foster care, bouncing from house to house, who had stitched her life together with late-night shifts and calloused hands, who had swallowed loneliness like medicine just to keep moving forward. How could I be the one he meant? Yet the memories came rushing back, uninvited and unstoppable. The quiet nights when he asked me about my childhood, his voice brittle but attentive, how he had leaned in, listening, with a hunger I hadn't understood at the time, how he pressed gently for the details of my earliest years, and how he had stilled when I mentioned a mother I could barely remember. I told him once her name was Anne. He had closed his eyes then, as though the syllables had pierced through years of silence. At the time, I thought it was fatigue. Now I knew it had been recognition. Faces around me blurred, but his face burned bright in my mind. Those evenings when he smiled faintly as I entered the room. The soft way he repeated my name, as though reassuring himself it was real. Elizabeth. The same name he carried like a wound. The one that lived in his stories. About a family lost in storms of bitterness and pride. All along, he hadn't been speaking into the void. He had been speaking to me. The lawyer's words still hung in the air, but the rest of the room erupted in protest. Voices clashed, accusations, disbelief, demands. I felt their stares like daggers, slicing me open, trying to expose me as a fraud. But the louder they grew, the quieter I felt inside, because some part of me was awakening to a truth that had been waiting all my life. He had known, long before ink and signatures, long before his final breath. He had seen me for who I was, and in that moment, the fortune itself meant nothing. What mattered was the shift in my bones, the sudden unraveling of the story I had told myself for years, that I was unwanted, unseen, unanchored. I had belonged all along, not by chance, not by convenience, but by blood and choice. Tears threatened, but I held them back, not out of pride, but because I wanted to savor the weight of it. I wanted to feel every inch of what it meant to stand there, no longer invisible. The wealth he left behind was vast enough to drown me, but the inheritance that mattered was far greater. The truth that I was not lost. I had been found. For the first time in my life, I felt what it meant to be chosen. Not for what I could give, not for what I could endure, but for who I had always been. Even when I didn't know it myself, when the voices finally dulled, and the air in that room grew heavy with resentment, I stepped out into the daylight, carrying more than papers and signatures. I carried the truth of who I was, the quiet certainty that I had not wandered all my life without roots. The fortune was staggering, yes, but what shook me deeper was the gift of belonging. A place in a story I never knew I had been part of. I thought of Mr. Alcott, of the way he had looked at me, with eyes that held both regret and hope, and I realized he hadn't left me money to change my life. He had left me recognition to heal it. The mansions, the accounts, the legacy, they were simply vessels. What mattered was the whisper behind it all. You were never forgotten. You were never alone. As I walked away from the lawyer's office, I lifted my face to the sky. For the first time, the weight I carried was not that of loneliness or survival. It was of possibility, and in my heart, I promised him that I would not waste what he had given me. Not the wealth, not the name, and not the chance to live as someone finally seen. Because the greatest inheritance was not his fortune. It was the truth that even the lost can be found. And even the unseen can one day step fully into the light.